I never imagined that a single desperate dive onto unforgiving pavement, an act born from nothing but instinct to shield a stranger's child, would unravel a web of corruption and bring a powerful, vindictive woman to her knees. I certainly had no idea that the small, warm body I clutched against the roar of a speeding car belonged to the son of one of the wealthiest men in the country. But it did. And that one moment, that one selfless act from a woman who had nothing, changed everything. The world had snapped into a terrifying, hyper-focused reality. 1 second I was just a ghost on the sidewalk, invisible as I'd become. The next, a flash of bright blue fabric, tiny legs pumping with innocent joy, a child's giggle slicing through the city's cacophony. Then the other sound, the deep, angry roar of an engine pushed too hard, the high-pitched squeal of tires fighting for grip and failing. My breath caught, a painful knot in my chest. There was no time for rational thought, no moment to weigh the risks to a life most people, including the woman who would soon become my tormentor, considered utterly worthless. There was only a silent scream in my soul, a primal, overwhelming urge to protect, to shield. My body moved before my mind could even process the danger. It was a ragged, desperate dive, the rough concrete tearing at my knees and hands. The blistering heat from the car's engine washed over my face, a sickening blast of hot, metallic air. I distinctly remember the thud as my shoulder connected with something small, something soft, and I instinctively curled around it, making my own body a desperate, fragile shield. Then came the sickening screech of brakes, a sound that ripped through the very air I was struggling to breathe, followed by a sudden, deafening silence that pressed in on my eardrums. For one horrifying, stretched-out second, I was convinced I'd been too late. The weight in my arms was terrifyingly, utterly still. My name is Sarah. For the past 2 agonizing years, the cold, unforgiving concrete of this sprawling city had been my bed, its indifferent, often starless sky my only ceiling. As a woman who had systematically lost everything dear to me, invisibility had become my reluctant cloak, my only defense. I once had a life most would consider normal. A small, sunlit apartment, a cherished job as a library assistant, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and the quiet hum of stories waiting to be discovered. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. A cruel cascade of unfortunate events. My beloved library facing drastic budget cuts, a predatory landlord who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity, and a family that had fractured beyond repair long ago, had pushed me, inch by painful inch, to the desolate fringes of society. Life on the streets is a brutal, relentless teacher. It taught me to read the subtle shifts in the weather through the persistent ache in my bones, to find sustenance in forgotten corners where most people wouldn't even glance. It taught me to recognize the fleeting warmth of kindness in the smallest gestures. A partially eaten sandwich left on a bench, a hesitant but genuine smile from a fellow outcast. But it also schooled me harshly in the other side of human nature. The casual, unthinking cruelty, the deliberately averted gazes, the poorly masked disgust that twisted otherwise ordinary faces. You learn very quickly to make yourself small, to occupy as little space as humanly possible. You learn that your worth, in the eyes of so many, is less than the discarded gum stuck stubbornly to the sidewalk. Each day was an exhausting battle for the smallest of dignities. The constant search for a relatively safe place to lay my head, a public restroom where I could wash the city's grime from my skin, the scrounging for enough spare change to buy a single cup of hot coffee, a small weapon against the biting morning chill. Memories of my old life would surface at unexpected moments, a sharp, painful ache spreading through my chest. The distinct smell of aging books, the comforting warmth of my own bed, the simple, profound security of closing my own door against the world. It all felt like a distant, hazy dream, a life lived by someone else, someone I no longer recognized. Now, my world was a stark landscape of survival, of endurance, and of observation. When you are invisible, you see things others miss. You hear whispers. You become a silent, unwilling witness to the city's countless hidden dramas. But even in the deepest, darkest pit of that hardship, some fundamental instincts remained stubbornly alive. The instinct to help. The instinct to care. An instinct that, on that one fateful sun-drenched Tuesday, was about to irrevocably alter the course of my life. And, though I was blissfully, terrifyingly unaware of it at the time, set in motion a chain of events that would bring about a very particular, very personal kind of justice. A justice I had long since stopped believing was even possible for someone like me. The primary disruption to my already precarious hand-to-mouth existence had a name, a face, and a chillingly polished voice: Councilwoman Victoria Evans. She was in every conceivable way my polar opposite, immaculately dressed, radiating power, and dripping with a self-righteous, barely concealed disdain for anyone she deemed beneath her lofty station. Her perfectly coiffed image was a regular fixture in the local newspapers and on community news channels, usually accompanied by carefully crafted sound bites about her ambitious plans for so-called urban renewal and her fervent desire for beautifying our city. To me, and to countless others like me, her flowery words were a thinly veiled, deeply unsettling threat. Beautifying, in her lexicon, always translated to removing the unsightly elements, and we, the city's forgotten, were undeniably the unsightly. My first direct, personal encounter with her power occurred about 6 months before the heart-stopping incident with the speeding car. I had managed to find a relatively sheltered alcove near a small, independent bakery, the warm, comforting scent of freshly baked bread a rare and welcome comfort. I wasn't begging, not even asking for anything, just sitting quietly, trying to shield myself from the biting wind that seemed to cut right through my threadbare coat. A sleek, obsidian black car, the kind that whispers of silent power, pulled silently to the curb, and out stepped Councilwoman Evans, a vision in a perfectly tailored suit, her sharp, assessing eyes sweeping the area. She was there, it turned out, for a carefully orchestrated photo opportunity, something to do with showing her unwavering support for local businesses. Her gaze, cold and dismissive, swept over me, and her perfectly painted lips, the color of expensive wine, curled into a subtle yet unmistakable sneer. She didn't deign to speak to me directly, of course. That would have been beneath her. Instead, she addressed her aide, a nervous-looking young man who clutched a tablet like a lifeline. Her voice, crisp and carrying clearly in the still air, instructed Jonathan to see to it that this was cleared away before the photographer arrived. It was, she declared, simply not acceptable. They were, after all, trying to project an image of prosperity. This, not her, not this person, this. The word, so casually thrown, stung more deeply than the bitter cold. I felt a hot flush of shame mixed with a potent, helpless anger creep up my neck. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered my meager, precious belongings: a worn, thin blanket, a half-empty plastic water bottle, and a tattered paperback novel, and moved on, her dismissive, tinkling laughter echoing unpleasantly in my ears. That was Victoria Evans. All radiant smiles for the flashing cameras, all glacial ice beneath the polished surface. And I knew, with a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, that she was only just getting started. Her particular brand of improving the city was destined to make life even more unbearable for those of us who had nowhere else to turn. Things began to change, subtly at first, then with a more aggressive, undeniable edge. New city ordinances, all championed and spearheaded by Councilwoman Evans and her much-publicized Clean Up Our Community initiative, started to appear with alarming regularity. Benches in public parks, once a small respite for weary legs, were systematically removed or redesigned with deliberately uncomfortable dividers, making it impossible for anyone to lie down. Loitering laws, previously enforced with a degree of leniency, were now applied with draconian strictness, especially in the bustling business districts she so frequently patronized for her photo ops. The few remaining public water fountains, a lifeline on hot days, were suddenly, mysteriously under repair for weeks, sometimes months on end. Each new restriction felt like another deliberate tightening of an invisible noose. The quiet, out-of-the-way corners where I could sometimes rest for an undisturbed hour disappeared one by one, like lights being extinguished. The humble soup kitchen, a place I relied on for a warm meal at least twice a week, had its municipal funding drastically cut, a decision publicly and vociferously championed by Evans in a televised statement where she decried what she termed enabling dependency. her face, so infuriatingly composed and righteous on the news screen, seemed to personally mock my growing, gnawing desperation. I vividly remember one particularly frigid evening. I'd managed to find what I thought was a relatively safe, concealed spot, tucked away behind some large, overflowing dumpsters at the rear of a sprawling shopping plaza. It wasn't ideal, the pervasive smell was undeniably awful, but it offered some crucial protection from the relentless, biting wind. Around midnight, just as I was drifting into an uneasy sleep, harsh, blinding floodlights suddenly blazed on, and a brand new security vehicle, recently hired by the plaza management at Evans's direct suggestion to local business associations, rolled menacingly to a halt beside me. A gruff, impatient voice ordered me to leave the premises immediately, threatening to call the police if I didn't comply without argument. He grunted that these were Councilwoman Evans's new directives. No more vagrants. Vagrant. Another dehumanizing label, carefully chosen to strip away any semblance of individuality, of humanity. I was tired. So incredibly bone-deeply tired. Not just the physical exhaustion that was my constant companion, but a profound, soul-crushing weariness. It felt like a deliberate, calculated, and cruel campaign to erase us, to make us so profoundly uncomfortable, so utterly unwelcome that we would simply vanish. Where did she imagine we would go? Did she even spare a single thought for that? Or did she simply not care? I encountered her again not long after that particularly demoralizing incident. She was giving yet another televised interview, this time in front of the newly renovated City Hall Plaza, a flagship project she had personally overseen and frequently boasted about. It was all gleaming, sterile marble and expensive, meticulously artful landscaping. Conspicuously, there was not a single bench in sight. She spoke with her characteristic feigned passion about progress, about instilling community pride. Behind her, invisible to the news camera but starkly visible to me, an elderly man I recognized, Thomas, who used to spend his afternoons playing chess in the old, more welcoming plaza, was being gently but firmly escorted away by a uniformed police officer merely for daring to sit on the edge of a large decorative planter. A cold, simmering fury began to smolder deep inside me. It was one thing to be ignored, to be rendered invisible by society's indifference. It was an entirely different, more malicious thing to be actively hunted, to be treated like vermin by someone who had cynically built her entire career on a carefully crafted platform of supposed civic duty and community betterment. The sheer, blatant injustice of it all was a bitter, acrid pill, one I was forced to swallow daily, hourly. But alongside the despair, a tiny, defiant spark was also kindling within me. She might believe she could sweep us away like common street dirt, but I was still here. And I was still watching. I was still bearing witness. The situation reached its devastating breaking point a few weeks later. There was a small, somewhat overgrown and largely forgotten patch of land nestled by the old, disused railway tracks. Over many months, a handful of us, the city's displaced, had organically created a sort of makeshift, fragile encampment there. We weren't causing any harm, troubling anyone. We kept the area as clean as possible, looked out for one another. In that forgotten space, a fragile, tentative sense of community had blossomed. A small, inadequate shield against the relentless harshness of the outside world. We had even managed to salvage a few large tarps that offered a modicum of protection from the rain and the dew. For people like us who had nothing else, it was a sanctuary, a tiny sliver of stability. Then, with much fanfare, Councilwoman Victoria Evans announced her next grand, ambitious undertaking, the Riverfront Revitalization Initiative. The forgotten, overgrown patch of land by the railway tracks, it turned out, was a crucial part of her grand vision. Suddenly, our small, neglected sanctuary was designated as prime, highly desirable real estate. The eviction notices arrived on a bleak Monday morning, plastered callously on trees and makeshift structures. They gave us a mere 48 hours to vacate the premises. 48 hours to dismantle the only semblance of stability some of us had known for months, or in some cases even years. Panic rippled through our small community, followed swiftly by a wave of profound despair. Where on earth were we supposed to go? The city's shelters were already chronically overcrowded. many of them operating with strict, often unworkable rules that were impossible for some of the most vulnerable among us to follow. On Wednesday morning, precisely as the 48-hour deadline expired, the bulldozers arrived, their diesel engines rumbling ominously. They were flanked by a formidable contingent of police cars and city workers clad in bright, official-looking vests. And there, overseeing the entire destructive operation with a look of grim, undisguised satisfaction etched on her face, was Councilwoman Victoria Evans herself. She wore a pristine white hard hat that looked comically, almost absurdly out of place with her expensive tailored pantsuit. She gestured occasionally with an air of unassailable authority, directing the workers as they began the methodical process of tearing down our meager, hard-won shelters. I stood at the edge of the devastation, my few remaining worldly possessions clutched tightly in a thin plastic grocery bag, watching in numb horror as everything was systematically razed to the ground. Old man Hemlock's carefully tended tomato plants, a source of pride and small sustenance, were crushed callously beneath the bulldozer's treads. Maria's treasured collection of worn, beloved stuffed animals, kept as a poignant reminder of her absent young daughter, were unceremoniously tossed into a gaping, rusty dumpster. The large, shared blanket we had all huddled under on particularly cold nights, a symbol of our fragile solidarity, was now just another piece of discarded debris. Evans walked past me, her eyes flicking over my disheveled form with that familiar, chilling disdain. I must have looked particularly wretched at that moment, covered in a fine layer of dust from the demolition, my face streaked with tears I couldn't seem to stop. She paused briefly, then said, her voice devoid of any discernible empathy, "That progress always has a price, my dear." The city, she continued, was moving forward. It was time, she concluded, that people like me either caught up or simply got out of the way. Her casual, breathtaking cruelty, the undisguised smugness on her face as she surveyed the ruin of our small, insignificant world, it was almost too much to bear. I felt something vital shatter deep inside me, but in that same instant something else, something harder and more resilient, began to form. It was in that precise moment, watching her command the destruction with such cold detachment, that I noticed something else, something I hadn't registered before. A sleek, expensive-looking black sedan, clearly not a city-owned vehicle, was parked a little way off, its tinted windows obscuring its occupants. A man in a very sharp, very expensive suit got out and spoke to Evans privately for a few minutes, his demeanor hushed and serious. He then handed her a thick, unmarked envelope, which she slipped discreetly into her oversized designer handbag with a subtle, almost imperceptible, knowing smile. The man had the distinct air of a wealthy property developer, the kind who stood to profit immensely from these so-called revitalization projects. It was a fleeting observation, a small, seemingly insignificant detail in the grand scheme of things, but it lodged itself firmly in my mind. Something about that hurried, secretive exchange felt distinctly off. It reeked of something clandestine. The despair I felt in that moment was profound, all-consuming. She had won. She had systematically stripped us of everything, even our last tattered shred of dignity, it seemed. And she clearly didn't care who she had to step on, or what questionable deals she had to make behind closed doors, to achieve her ambitions. I wandered away from the scene of destruction, feeling more lost, more adrift, more utterly alone than I had ever felt before. Little did I know fate, in its most unpredictable and astonishing form, was about to intervene directly in my life. That fateful Tuesday began much like any other bleak, featureless day. The air, even in the early morning, was heavy and humid, carrying the unwelcome promise of oppressive summer heat. I'd managed to snatch a few restless, uneasy hours of sleep huddled in a relatively sheltered doorway, only to be jolted awake by the familiar pre-dawn rumble of delivery trucks. My stomach growled its insistent, empty protest. I found myself heading towards a park situated on the wealthier, more manicured side of town, vaguely hoping to find some discarded newspapers for a bit of extra insulation against the night chill, maybe even the minor treasure of a half-eaten apple in one of the park's surprisingly clean bins. It was located near a fashionable strip of upscale cafes and exclusive boutiques, places I normally went to great lengths to avoid, but the park itself was at least technically public property. And then I saw her. Councilwoman Victoria Evans was actually there, seated comfortably at a wrought iron table outside a trendy sun-drenched cafe, holding court with a couple of individuals who looked like journalists or perhaps eager aides. A large, professional-looking camera was pointed in her direction occasionally. Another publicity stunt, no doubt. She was probably pontificating about her latest selfless community improvement efforts. I kept my head down, instinctively trying to make myself as inconspicuous as possible, skirting the very edge of the wide sidewalk. That's when I saw him. A little boy no more than 3 years old, wearing a bright blue t-shirt that stood out against the muted tones of the city, his head a mop of sunshine blonde curls. He'd been with a young woman, likely his nanny, who was momentarily, fatally distracted by something on her phone just outside the inviting window of a high-end toy store. With the sudden, unpredictable burst of energy so characteristic of a toddler, he spotted something across the busy street. Perhaps a pigeon strutting on the curb, or maybe just the irresistible allure of open, uncluttered space, and he bolted. Straight into the road, into the path of oncoming traffic. Everything happened in a horrifying, heart-stopping blur. The nanny's piercing shriek of his name, Leo. The sudden, angry, aggressive blare of a car horn. A sleek silver sedan, moving far too fast for a street lined with bustling shops and pedestrians, materialized as if from nowhere, a metallic predator. I saw Councilwoman Evans look up from her coffee, her expression initially one of mild, patrician annoyance at the sudden commotion, before her eyes widened slightly with dawning alarm. She didn't move. No one seemed to be moving fast enough. But I did. There was no conscious thought, no rational calculation, just pure, unadulterated, primal instinct. My tattered plastic bag containing all my worldly possessions dropped unheeded to the ground. I launched myself forward, a desperate, ungainly projectile. It was exactly like those surreal moments in movies where everything inexplicably shifts into slow motion. I saw the terrified, contorted face of the driver behind the windshield, the wide, innocent, uncomprehending eyes of the little boy, frozen mid-stride in the center of the road. I dove hard, my body slamming against the unforgiving asphalt with a force that violently knocked the air from my lungs. My arms, acting of their own accord, wrapped around the child's small, surprisingly solid frame, pulling him down, instinctively shielding him with my own body as the car swerved violently, its tires screaming in protest against the pavement. The vehicle missed us by mere inches, the powerful rush of displaced wind and the deafening roar of its engine assaulting my ears. Then an almost unnatural silence descended, broken only by the little boy's startled, terrified cry, muffled against my chest, and the nanny's rising, hysterical sobs from the sidewalk. I lay there for a long second, adrenaline coursing like wildfire through my veins, my entire body aching with a dull, throbbing pain, desperately checking the child. He was crying, clearly terrified, but as far as I could tell in that chaotic moment, miraculously unharmed. I remember gasping out that it was okay, he was okay, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar to my own ears. The nanny reached us first, practically snatching Leo into her arms, babbling incoherent thanks and fervent apologies through her streaming tears. A small, curious crowd was already beginning to gather. I saw Councilwoman Evans standing up from her table, looking visibly flustered, her carefully constructed, camera-ready photo-op now irrevocably ruined. She started to say something, probably to take authoritative charge of the situation as she was wont to do, when a large, imposing black limousine, the kind that speaks volumes of serious, old money, pulled up abruptly and silently to the curb. A man, impeccably dressed in a subdued but obviously expensive suit, yet with a look of sheer, naked terror etched on his face, leaped out. He wasn't flashy in his demeanor, but he radiated an undeniable aura of quiet, understated power. He rushed to the nanny, took the still sobbing child from her arms, and held him fiercely tight, his own face pale and drawn. He kept murmuring, "Leo, my boy, are you all right?" his voice strained with raw, unfiltered emotion. He looked sternly at the nanny for a moment, then his eyes, sharp and assessing, found me, still struggling to push myself into a sitting position on the curb, dazed and bruised, my clothes torn, my hands and knees scraped raw and bleeding. Councilwoman Evans chose that moment to step forward, a practiced, professionally concerned smile appearing almost magically on her lips. She addressed the man, saying, "Mr. Sterling, what a dreadful, dreadful thing. Thank goodness everyone is all right. This city," she added, "really needs to address its traffic calming measures, something she had been advocating for tirelessly." But Mr. Sterling wasn't looking at her. His gaze, intense and unwavering, was fixed solely on me. He gently handed Leo back to the now somewhat calmer, though still trembling nanny, and walked directly over to where I sat on the dirty pavement, feeling dazed and disoriented. He knelt down beside me, his expensive, perfectly creased trousers making contact with the grimy curb without a moment's hesitation. He asked if I was hurt, his voice surprisingly gentle, almost soft. I just managed to shake my head, still struggling to catch my breath properly. I asked about the boy, if he was truly. He confirmed that Leo was fine. "Thanks to me," he added, his eyes, a startlingly clear and piercing blue, searching mine as if trying to read my very soul. He said that I had saved his life. He then asked for my name. I told him it was Sarah. Councilwoman Evans tried to interject again, her voice taking on a slightly condescending tone. She started to say that, "Mr. Sterling, this woman is, well, she is one of the vagrants they were trying to help relocate. Perhaps," she suggested, "some small compensation for her trouble." She trailed off abruptly as Mr. Sterling silenced her with a single, almost imperceptible glance. A glance that was colder and more cutting than any harsh winter wind I'd ever had to endure. He turned his attention back to me. He repeated my name, Sarah, softly, as if committing it to memory. He then introduced himself as Alexander Sterling. He stated that Leo was his son. He finished by saying he owed me a debt he could never truly, fully repay. The name Sterling, it rang a distant bell. A very, very big resonant bell. Sterling Industries. One of the wealthiest, most influential, and notoriously private families in the entire country, if not the world. And I, Sarah, a homeless woman invisible to most, had just saved his only son. The sheer, staggering magnitude of the twist of fate was so immense, so utterly unbelievable, it felt like I had stepped into some surreal, vivid dream. Councilwoman Evans's jaw, I noted with a strange sense of detached amusement, was practically resting on the pavement. The look of dawning horror and disbelief on her face when she finally, belatedly, realized who she had just tried to dismiss with such casual contempt was a mental picture I knew I would treasure for a very long time. Mr. Sterling insisted, with quiet but firm authority, that I go to the hospital to get checked out, despite my repeated protests that I was perfectly fine, just a few scrapes. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He dismissed his personal driver and personally, incredibly, escorted me to his waiting limousine, a vehicle more opulent and luxurious than any home I'd inhabited in years. Councilwoman Evans just stood there on the sidewalk, her mouth agape, her entourage looking equally stunned and uncertain. The profound, almost comical irony of the situation wasn't lost on me for a single second. The very woman who had publicly declared her intention to have people like me cleared away, was now watching me being chauffeured off in style by one of the city's, and indeed the nation's, most powerful and influential men. At the hospital, I was treated like visiting royalty, an experience so foreign and bewildering it felt like an out-of-body experience. Mr. Sterling stayed by my side, quietly and efficiently ensuring I received the absolute best care available. My physical injuries, thankfully, turned out to be relatively superficial, a collection of scrapes and bruises, a sprained wrist that throbbed painfully, but the emotional and psychological shock was significant. Once I was cleaned up, bandaged, and settled in a private, comfortable room, he sat with me. He didn't press me with questions, just waited patiently, his calm demeanor strangely soothing. Finally, he began to speak, his voice calm, measured, and utterly sincere. He told me, Sarah, that he meant what he had said earlier. He owed me more than just effusive thanks, more than mere money could ever represent. He then asked if there was anything at all that he could possibly do for me. This was it. The moment. The unexpected, unbelievable crossroads. My mind raced, a whirlwind of possibilities. I could ask for money, enough to get off the streets for good, to find a small place of my own. But then looking at this man, Alexander Sterling, who seemed genuinely kind and deeply grateful, and simultaneously picturing Victoria Evans's smug, self-satisfied face, a different, bolder idea began to take shape. The vivid, painful memory of her standing there, coolly overseeing the brutal destruction of our small, fragile encampment, her dismissive, cruel words still echoing in my ears, and that fleeting yet troubling image of the secret envelope she'd received from that shadowy developer, it all coalesced in my mind with sudden, startling clarity. I took a deep breath. I told Mr. Sterling that there was something. It was not just about me. And so I told him everything. I told him about my life, the series of misfortunes that had led me to homelessness. I told him in detail about Councilwoman Victoria Evans, about her relentless, cruel campaign against the city's homeless population, the constant harassment, the public humiliation, the systematic stripping away of dignity. I described the brutal demolition of our makeshift shelter, the loss of what little we had. And then, hesitantly at first but with growing conviction, I mentioned the man with the envelope, the brief, furtive and deeply suspicious exchange I had witnessed between him and Evans. I confessed I wasn't sure if it meant anything significant, but I told him anyway because it had felt wrong. He listened with unwavering, intense concentration, his expression growing more serious, more grim with every word I spoke. He didn't interrupt me once, just let me pour out my story, my frustrations, my observations. When I finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room for a long moment. Then he looked directly at me, a new, steely resolve hardening his clear blue eyes. He said, "Sarah, what you did for Leo today, it showed incredible, astounding courage and profound selflessness. What you have endured at the hands of this city and specifically this councilwoman, it is an outrage." He admitted that Councilwoman Evans's name was indeed familiar to him. Her various revitalization projects had raised certain eyebrows before, he explained, but no one had ever managed to find concrete, actionable proof of any actual impropriety. He paused, then added thoughtfully that perhaps my observation, seemingly small, was far more significant than I realized. Over the next few incredibly surreal days, my life transformed at a dizzying, almost warp speed. Mr. Sterling arranged for me to stay in a comfortable, well-appointed suite in an extended-stay hotel. He provided me with new, clean clothes, an abundance of food, and even a dedicated personal assistant, a kind woman named Emily, to help with anything I might need. It was overwhelming, almost too much to take in, but also incredibly, deeply validating. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt seen. I felt human again. But Mr. Sterling was doing far more than just helping me on a personal level. He had his own team of highly skilled investigators, men and women who were discreet, thorough, and incredibly efficient. He informed them about my observation regarding Councilwoman Evans and the mysterious developer. He had said to me with a grim, determined smile, "Let us see what a little bit of professional digging uncovers." The confrontation, when it finally arrived, was far more public, more dramatic, and infinitely more satisfying than I could have ever dared to imagine in my wildest dreams. About 2 weeks later, Councilwoman Victoria Evans was scheduled to give a major, highly publicized presentation at a televised town hall meeting. She was going to proudly unveil the next exciting phase of her controversial riverfront revitalization initiative, the very same project that had so callously displaced me and my friends. She was beaming under the stage lights, radiating confidence, clearly expecting widespread accolades and applause. The hall was packed to capacity. Every local media outlet was present, cameras rolling. Evans was in her absolute element, speaking with her customary polished eloquence about progress, prosperity, and her unwavering vision for the city's glorious future. Then, midway through her carefully rehearsed presentation, the large double doors at the back of the expansive hall opened, and Alexander Sterling walked calmly and deliberately in. An immediate, palpable hush fell over the entire room. Evans faltered visibly, her practiced, confident smile freezing unnaturally on her face. Mr. Sterling walked with unhurried composure to the public microphone set up for citizen comments. He began, his voice resonant and carrying clearly to every corner of the hall, addressing Councilwoman Evans. Her vision for the city, he acknowledged, was ambitious. However, he continued, his tone firm. He believed that true, lasting progress must always be inclusive, ethical, and, above all, compassionate. He then proceeded to announce a staggering multi-million-dollar donation from his family's charitable foundation to a newly formed coalition of local charities, all dedicated to providing real, tangible, sustainable solutions for homelessness, comprehensive shelter programs, vital job training initiatives, and accessible mental health services. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of sound that seemed to physically buffet Evans. She looked as though she'd been struck. But he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He continued, his gaze fixing intently on the now visibly shaken Evans, stating that furthermore, it had recently come to his attention that some of these so-called revitalization efforts might not be entirely transparent. At that precise moment, the large projection screens in the hall, which moments before had been displaying Councilwoman Evans's glossy, idealized architectural renderings, flickered and abruptly changed. They now displayed a cascade of damning, irrefutable evidence. Detailed bank statements showing unexplained deposits, copies of internal city documents revealing zoning changes pushed through with suspicious, almost unseemly haste, and even covertly filmed surveillance footage. The footage showed Evans meeting secretly with the very same developer I had seen her with weeks before, clearly accepting what was unmistakably a substantial cash bribe in exchange for preferential treatment and lucrative land deals. The shady, unmarked envelope I'd seen her discreetly pocket was now, in essence, Exhibit A in her public trial. The hall erupted into chaos. Shouts of outrage, gasps of disbelief. Councilwoman Victoria Evans turned a ghostly, sickly shade of pale. She tried desperately to speak, to deny the undeniable, but her trembling voice was completely drowned out by the uproar. She stammered that these allegations, they were baseless, outrageous, but the evidence displayed for all to see was stark, clear, and utterly irrefutable. Mr. Sterling's investigators had, indeed, been exceptionally thorough. Then Mr. Sterling did something I hadn't anticipated in the slightest. He looked towards the side of the hall where I was sitting, not in my old tattered street clothes, but in a simple, dignified dress that his kind assistant, Emily, had helped me select. He announced to the stunned assembly that there was someone present tonight, someone who truly embodied the resilient spirit of their city. Someone, he declared, whose bravery and innate integrity stood in stark, illuminating contrast to the blatant greed and staggering corruption they had all just witnessed. He then asked Sarah if I would care to say a few words. All eyes in that crowded, suddenly silent hall turned towards me. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in my ears. But as I slowly rose and walked towards the podium, I felt a surge of strength, a profound sense of calm and purpose I hadn't known I possessed. I looked directly at Victoria Evans, her face now a grotesque mask of horror, disbelief, and dawning despair. And then I told my story. Simply. Honestly. Without embellishment. I spoke of the daily struggle for survival, the crushing weight of invisibility, and the small, impulsive act of saving a child's life that had, improbably, almost miraculously, led to this extraordinary pivotal moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The unvarnished truth I discovered was powerful enough on its own. When I finished speaking, there was a moment of profound, almost reverent silence, which was then shattered by an ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Victoria Evans, her face ashen, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal, was quietly but firmly escorted out of the hall by security personnel, her once stellar career and carefully cultivated reputation lying in smoking, irreparable ruins around her. Justice, it turned out, could be incredibly, wonderfully satisfying. The aftermath was swift, decisive, and very public. Councilwoman Evans faced multiple official investigations, was quickly forced to resign from her position in utter disgrace, and the developer with whom she had been colluding was also swiftly indicted on bribery charges. Her meticulously constructed public image as a dedicated civic leader shattered into a million pieces, replaced by the sordid reality of a corrupt, deeply self-serving and callous politician. The local news channels, which had once eagerly broadcast her polished speeches and smiling photo ops, now dedicated considerable airtime to detailing every sordid aspect of her dramatic downfall. It was karma, pure and simple, served up on a gleaming silver platter, though to me, it felt more like it was served on the cold, hard concrete she had so contemptuously tried to sweep us from. As for me, my life took a turn so profound, so unexpected, that I still sometimes struggle to believe it's real. Mr. Sterling didn't just offer me a temporary handout or a fleeting moment of charity. He offered me a genuine, life-altering opportunity. With his considerable backing and leveraging the unexpected wave of public goodwill I had garnered, I became deeply involved with the very charities his foundation had so generously funded. I now work as an advocate, a voice for those still struggling on the unforgiving streets, using my own hard-won experiences to try and bridge the often vast gap between their hidden world and the resources that are or should be available to them. He also helped me find a small, comfortable apartment of my own. A quiet, peaceful place with a door I could close and lock, a bed that was always warm and inviting, and shelves that I am slowly, joyfully filling with books once more. Sometimes I still walk through the familiar streets of the city, but I am no longer invisible. People see me now. More importantly, they listen. The memory of that terrifying, adrenaline-fueled dive, the piercing screech of tires, the small, precious, warm weight of a child's body clutched in my arms, it's still incredibly vivid, etched forever in my mind. But now that memory is inextricably intertwined with the astounding knowledge that one impulsive, unplanned act of basic human decency not only saved a young life but also triggered an unforeseen cascade of events that brought down a powerful, callous woman and, in its own small, significant way, helped to restore a tiny bit of balance, a sliver of justice, to a world that often seems to have too little of either. I learned that even when you feel completely, utterly powerless, stripped of everything you once valued, you still possess your integrity. And sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing, the compassionate thing, even when it seems to offer no personal gain, can lead to a form of justice so profound, so perfectly, poetically tailored to the circumstances, it leaves you breathless with the sheer, unexpected, and deeply gratifying satisfaction of it all. The world can undoubtedly be a dark and often cruel place, but a single courageous act, a single conscious moment of choosing compassion over indifference, can ignite a light bright enough to chase away even the deepest, most oppressive shadows. And that, I've come to realize, is a form of revenge far sweeter, far more meaningful, than any I could have ever plotted or schemed for on my own.